Tommy Hayes wiped the sweat from his brow as the New Mexico sun began to set on his farm just outside Roswell. The orange glow painted long shadows across his fields, a sight that usually brought him peace after a long day's work. But tonight was different. Something in the air felt wrong, electric, like the moments before a storm, but the sky was clear and star-filled. At 43, Tommy had lived his entire life in Roswell. The small farm he inherited from his father was modest, but sufficient. He preferred the quiet solitude of rural life, especially after returning from the Pacific Theater 3 years prior. The war had left him with nightmares and a desire for isolation that his neighbors respected, but didn't understand. As darkness settled over the land, Tommy sat on his porch, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the vast expanse of stars above. That's when he saw it, a brilliant streak of light cutting across the night sky. Not a shooting star, something else entirely. It moved too deliberately, too slowly, leaving a shimmer in its wake like heat ripples on asphalt. "What in God's name?" he muttered, standing up as the light suddenly halted mid-flight, hovering for several seconds before plummeting toward Earth. The impact came with a sound Tommy could only describe later as a scream, not mechanical, not explosive, but organic and wailing. The ground shook beneath his feet, knocking his whiskey glass to the wooden porch where it shattered. A flash illuminated the desert landscape like midday for a brief moment, and then darkness returned, heavier than before. Curiosity overwhelmed caution as Tommy grabbed his shotgun and flashlight, jumping into his pickup truck. The crash site couldn't be more than 2 miles from his property, just beyond the ridge that marked his eastern boundary. As he drove, the radio in his truck went haywire, stations blending together in a cacophony of voices and static before dying altogether. The site was easy to find. A shallow crater, perhaps 50 feet across, marred the desert floor, but what Tommy found wasn't a meteorite or anything recognizable. The wreckage scattered across the depression didn't look like metal, at least no metal Tommy had ever seen. It had a pearlescent quality, surfaces that seemed to shift and flow even as they maintained solid form. Pieces resembled bone as much as machinery, with joints and seams that looked grown rather than manufactured. "Jesus," Tommy whispered, approaching cautiously. His flashlight beam caught a puddle of viscous fluid that seemed to retreat from the light, flowing like mercury away from the beam's touch. Against every instinct screaming in his mind, Tommy reached down to touch a fragment. The material was warm, body temperature, and seemed to pulse under his fingertips. The moment skin made contact, a vision slammed into his consciousness with such force he fell backward. Vast caverns stretching infinitely beneath the earth. Whispers in a language so ancient it felt carved into his soul rather than heard. Figures moving in darkness, twisted forms that his mind couldn't properly interpret, and beneath it all, a sense of hunger, ancient, patient, and utterly malevolent. Tommy came back to himself, gasping on the desert floor, his heart hammering against his ribs. His hand, the one that touched the fragment, felt numb and tingled with pins and needles that slowly crawled up his arm. He scrambled away from the debris, suddenly certain that whatever had crashed here wasn't from the stars, it was something much worse. Before he could flee, headlights crested the ridge. Within minutes, military vehicles surrounded the crater, men in uniform establishing a perimeter with shocking efficiency. A woman emerged from a black sedan, her movements precise and calculated. She wore civilian clothes, a tailored suit that looked expensive and out of place in the desert night. "Mr. Hayes," she said, approaching him directly, "I'm Agent Linda Faulkner. You shouldn't be here." Tommy stared at her bewildered. "How do you know my name? What is all this?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "We monitor this area closely. What you've witnessed tonight is a classified weather balloon crash. Nothing more." "That's not a weather balloon," Tommy insisted, pointing at the debris. "I touched it. I saw—" "You saw nothing," Faulkner interrupted, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You were never here, Mr. Hayes. Return to your farm, forget this night and live your life. The alternative would be unfortunate." As she spoke, men in hazmat suits carefully collected the debris, paying special attention to the fluid that continued to move with apparent purpose across the crater floor. Tommy noticed some of the men avoided touching the material directly, using specialized tools to handle the fragments. "The government thanks you for your discretion and patriotism," Faulkner added, pressing a folded document into his hand. "Sign this, please." Tommy looked down at a non-disclosure agreement, the government seal prominent at the top. His hand trembled as he signed, not from fear of Faulkner's thinly veiled threat, but because the numbness had spread to his shoulder and strange patterns seemed to dance at the edges of his vision. That night marked the beginning of Tommy's descent. Sleep brought vivid nightmares, underground chambers filled with writhing shadows, walls carved with symbols that burned into his mind. He would wake screaming, certain that something was watching him from the darkest corner of his bedroom. The local paper reported a weather balloon crash, just as Faulkner had insisted. Life in Roswell continued unchanged, but Tommy knew better. The visions grew worse each night. He began keeping a journal, documenting everything he could remember, the symbols, the whispers, the growing certainty that something ancient had awakened and was now watching humanity through eyes both old and new. 2 weeks after the crash, Tommy noticed a black sedan parked at the edge of his property. It would appear at odd hours, sometimes with Faulkner visible behind the wheel, sometimes with men he didn't recognize. They were watching him, studying him, waiting for something. The numbness in his arm had receded, replaced by heightened sensitivity. Food tasted wrong, colors seemed more vibrant, sounds more complex. He began hearing whispers when alone, fragments of that ancient language from his visions. Worst of all was the growing urge to return to the crash site, to dig into the earth beneath it, to go deeper where something was calling to him. Tommy knew he needed help. The visions were showing him things no human was meant to see, revealing truths about the world that shattered his understanding of reality. The entity that crashed wasn't from another planet. It was from here, from Earth, but from a time before humans walked upright, before mammals dominated the land. It had been imprisoned, forgotten, erased from history, and now it was waking up. And Tommy Hayes, simple farmer from Roswell, New Mexico, was its unwilling herald. Special Agent Samuel Greene stared out the window of the government-issued sedan as the New Mexico landscape rolled by in shades of brown and red. After years investigating unusual phenomena for the FBI, he'd developed a sixth sense for when a case would change him. This one made that sense scream louder than ever before. The folder on his lap contained the official reports about the Roswell incident, a weather balloon, some experimental radar equipment, nothing to concern the American public. But Greene had seen the unofficial photographs, the ones showing material that defied explanation and the expression of abject terror on the faces of the first military personnel to arrive on scene. "We're almost there, Agent Greene," said the driver, a young military man who hadn't spoken more than 10 words since picking him up from the airfield. Greene nodded and returned to the file. What troubled him most wasn't the crash itself, but the pattern of similar incidents throughout history in this same region, dating back to Spanish colonial records, describing silver flying shields, and demons that whispered madness. Each incident was followed by disappearances and reports of mental instability among locals who claimed to have witnessed the events. The car pulled up to a nondescript building on the outskirts of the Roswell Army Airfield. Despite its mundane appearance, the security was anything but. 3 checkpoints with armed guards who scrutinized his credentials with suspicious thoroughness. Inside, the facility hummed with activity. Men in lab coats hurried between rooms carrying folders and equipment. Military personnel stood at attention at key junctions. Greene was led to a conference room where a woman sat alone, reviewing documents spread across the table. Dr. Evelyn Carter. She introduced herself, not bothering to stand. Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct and analytical. "I understand you're here to investigate anomalous reports surrounding our weather balloon incident." Greene noted her emphasis on the cover story. "That's right, though we both know it wasn't a weather balloon." Carter's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. "Follow me." She led him through a series of hallways to a secure laboratory. After another identity check, they entered a room kept at near freezing temperatures. In the center, under bright lights, lay fragments of the wreckage on examination tables. "What you're seeing doesn't exist," Carter said flatly. "According to official records, these materials were never recovered, never examined, and this conversation isn't happening." Greene approached the tables. The material defied easy categorization, metallic yet organic, with surfaces that seemed to ripple subtly under the harsh lighting. Some pieces appeared to have fused with biological matter in ways that suggested deliberate design rather than traumatic collision. "What is it?" he asked. "That's the multi-million-dollar question," Carter replied, pulling up microscope images on a nearby screen. "The material has a cellular structure, but not one matching any known life form. It responds to electrical stimulation. Parts of it appear to be technology, circuitry, components, but grown rather than manufactured." Greene had seen strange things during the war. In the final days, as Allied forces pushed into Germany, his unit had discovered Nazi research facilities conducting experiments that still haunted his dreams. But this was different, not human madness, but something entirely outside human understanding. "And the pilot?" he asked. Carter's expression darkened. "That's where things get complicated. Follow me." A secure elevator took them 3 levels down. The temperature dropped further as they entered a morgue-like room. In the center, a body lay covered on a metal table. "Prepare yourself," Carter warned, then pulled back the sheet. What lay beneath only superficially resembled a human form. The proportions were wrong, limbs too long, joints additional and misplaced. The skin had a gray pallor with undertones of blue that shifted in the light. But most disturbing was the face, almost human, but with features that seemed to move subtly even in death, as though the flesh hadn't quite received the news that its host had expired. "This isn't an alien," Greene stated, fighting the urge to step back. "No," Carter agreed. "DNA analysis confirms it's human, or was originally, but it's been extensively modified at the cellular level. The brain structure is particularly interesting." She indicated a series of X-rays on a light board. "See these formations? They're similar to antenna structures found in certain deep-sea creatures, allowing them to detect electromagnetic fields, but far more advanced." "You're saying it was engineered?" Greene asked. "Or evolved, but not naturally and not recently. The modifications appear to be the result of gradual adaptation over generations." Greene thought of the reports he'd reviewed. "The locals. Have there been any unusual behaviors reported since the crash?" Carter's hesitation told him everything. "We've had 7 cases of acute psychological breakdown and people who came into contact with debris before containment. 3 suicides, 4 others under observation. They report dreams, visions, voices urging them to travel to specific locations in the desert." "And the farmer who first discovered the crash site?" "Tommy Hayes, he's resilient. Most subjects break within days. He's still functioning, but showing signs of influence. We're monitoring him closely." Greene needed to speak with Hayes. If he was resisting whatever effect the crash debris had on human minds, he might provide valuable insights. That afternoon, Greene found himself parked outside Hayes' modest farmhouse. The place looked neglected, fields untended, equipment idle. A perfect circle had been dug in the yard, filled with small stones arranged in patterns that made Greene's eyes hurt if he looked too long. Hayes answered the door after the 3rd knock, shotgun in hand. He looked haggard, eyes sunken and bloodshot, several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. He studied Greene with suspicion. "Another government man," he said, "not a question. Come to tell me again it was a weather balloon." Greene showed his badge. "Agent Samuel Greene, FBI. May I come in?" Hayes laughed, a brittle sound with no humor in it. "Why not? You'll come in anyway." The interior of the house was worse than Greene expected. The walls of the living room were covered in charcoal drawings, intricate patterns, cave systems, symbols that seemed to change when viewed peripherally. Newspaper clippings about the crash and historical incidents in the region were pinned in clusters, connected by red string. "They're watching me," Hayes said, gesturing vaguely toward the window. "Black car, different people, but always watching. They think I don't notice." "Agent Faulkner's people," Greene confirmed. "I'm not with them." Hayes studied him. "You want to know what I saw?" I want to know what you're still seeing, Greene corrected. The visions, the dreams. Something changed in Hayes' expression, relief perhaps at being taken seriously. He retrieved a leather-bound journal from a drawer and handed it to Greene. It's all in there, everything I remember, everything I see each night. It's not from space, you know, whatever crashed. It's from here, from below. It's old, older than anything, and it's just one of many. Greene opened the journal. Pages of meticulous drawings and notes chronicled Hayes' descent into obsession. Cave systems that shouldn't exist according to geological surveys. Descriptions of an ancient underground civilization predating human history. And repeated references to the awakening. Have you shown this to anyone else? Greene asked. Hayes shook his head. Who would believe me? But you do, don't you? You've seen something like this before. Greene thought of a bunker in Bavaria, of experiments blending human and non-human tissues, of Nazi scientists babbling about elder gods, and sleepers beneath. He'd dismissed it as the ravings of desperate men trying to justify atrocities. Now he wasn't so sure. I need to take this, he said, holding up the journal. I'll return it, I promise. Hayes nodded, then froze, head tilted as though listening. They're coming, he whispered. They know you're here. Greene moved to the window. A black sedan had indeed pulled up outside, Agent Faulkner emerging from the driver's side. Mr. Hayes, Greene said urgently, I need you to tell me, what do they want? Faulkner's people, what are they doing with the materials they recovered? Hayes' eyes widened, fear evident. Not studying it, using it. They think they can control it, harness it, but they're wrong. It's using them. It always has been. Greene handed Hayes a card with his hotel information. If you need me, call. Don't tell Faulkner I was here. He slipped out the back door as knocking began at the front, circling around to his car parked down the road. As he drove away, he caught a glimpse of Faulkner in his rearview mirror, watching his departure with cold calculation. Back at his hotel, Greene called Dr. Carter, arranging to meet somewhere they wouldn't be overheard. They chose a diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the coffee was terrible, but the privacy reliable. Carter arrived looking exhausted. I shouldn't be here, she said, sliding into the booth across from him. Faulkner's people are watching the lab, watching me. They're watching Hayes too, Greene replied, pushing a cup of coffee toward her. I think they're using him as a test subject, seeing how the material affects him long term. Carter didn't look surprised. There's more happening than a simple crash investigation. Ever heard of Project Amalgam? Greene shook his head. It's classified beyond top secret. I only found references because I have access to the biological samples. It's a program studying the integration of non-human consciousness with human hosts. Non-human as in, not extraterrestrial, Carter clarified. Indigenous but non-human. The working theory is that Earth was home to an advanced civilization long before humans evolved. They were sealed away somehow, their technology and bodies buried deep underground. What crashed in Roswell wasn't a spacecraft, it was a containment vessel, and it was coming from below, not above. Greene thought of Hayes' journal. Hayes drew cave systems, underground chambers, said the voices were urging him to specific locations in the desert. Carter nodded grimly. There are unusual geological formations around Roswell, not natural, too perfectly arranged. When mapped from above, they form a geometric pattern centered on an abandoned mine shaft about 30 miles from here. Faulkner knows this. Faulkner's organization isn't trying to contain what was in that crash. They're trying to use it. Imagine weapons that could influence enemy minds, technology centuries beyond our understanding. We need to see that mine shaft, Greene decided. Carter hesitated. People who get too close to the truth have been disappearing, Greene. 3 of my colleagues transferred suddenly to undisclosed locations after questioning the official narrative. Then we need to move quickly, Greene replied. Tonight, before Faulkner realizes what we know. As they left the diner, neither noticed the nondescript man in the corner booth, who placed a coin on the table and followed them out a few minutes later. That night, as Greene reviewed Hayes' journal in his hotel room, a knock came at his door. He drew his service weapon before answering. It was Hayes, looking even worse than before, trembling and pale. "They were in my house," he gasped, "going through everything. I slipped away, but they'll realize I'm gone soon." Greene ushered him inside, checking the hallway before closing the door. "What happened?" "Faulkner, Hayes stopped mid-sentence, his eyes rolling back. He collapsed to his knees, body rigid, mouth open in a silent scream. When his eyes opened again, they were different, darker. The pupils expanded until almost no iris remained. When he spoke, his voice had changed, deepened, with an accent Greene couldn't place. "The vessel has been compromised," Hayes said, the words precise and formal. "The awakening approaches. The sleepers stir." Greene backed away, gun raised. "Hayes, Tommy." Hayes tilted his head, the movement jerky and unnatural. "The vessel designated Hayes is temporarily occupied. We have waited millennia. Our prison weakens. Your kind seeks our power without understanding. Foolish." "What are you?" Greene demanded. Hayes, or whatever was speaking through him, smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. "We are the firstborn of this world. We ruled when your ancestors were prey animals scurrying in darkness. We were imprisoned by a fluke, a cosmic accident, but never destroyed." The crash, Greene pressed, keeping his gun steady. What was it? A fragment of our consciousness, attempting to reach the surface, damaged in transit, but sufficient. The vessel Hayes touched it, became connected. Others too, seeds planted in fertile minds. Greene thought quickly. These seeds, what do they do? Grow, change, prepare. When enough minds are opened, the barrier falls. We return. This world becomes ours again. Hayes suddenly gasped, his body convulsing. He fell forward, catching himself on his hands, breathing heavily. When he looked up, his eyes were his own again, filled with terror. "It's inside me," he whispered. "God help me, it's inside all of us who touched it." Greene helped him to a chair. "How long has this been happening?" "Days, getting worse. I black out, wake up miles from home, dirt under my fingernails like I've been digging. It wants something in that mine shaft Carter mentioned, something buried deep." Greene made a decision. "We're going there, tonight. Carter's meeting us in an hour. Whatever's happening, the answers are at that mine." Hayes shook his head frantically. "No, that's what it wants, for us to go there, to dig, to free them." "Then we go prepared," Greene insisted. "We need to know what we're fighting." As they prepared to leave, Greene noticed Hayes staring at his own reflection in the bathroom mirror, whispering to it in that ancient language that had emerged during his possession. The transformation was progressing faster than anyone realized. Time was running out. The abandoned mineshaft loomed before them, a black wound in the earth surrounded by crumbling structures and rusted machinery. The moon hung full and bright above, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Greene cut the engine of their borrowed truck, and silence descended, a heavy, waiting silence that seemed to press against their ears. "This is a mistake," Tommy whispered, his hands trembling as he clutched Hayes' journal. "It's calling us here, using us." Dr. Carter checked her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "That may be true, but ignorance won't save us. Whatever's happening, we need to understand it." Greene retrieved a case from the truck bed, opening it to reveal his service weapon, extra ammunition, and 3 military-grade flashlights. He'd also brought climbing equipment and, at Carter's insistence, sample collection kits. "Stay close," he instructed. "If anyone feels different, speak up immediately." The entrance to the mine was partially collapsed, requiring them to squeeze through a narrow opening. The air inside was stale, carrying a metallic tang that coated the tongue and lingered in the back of the throat. Their flashlight beams revealed a standard mine shaft that extended about 100 feet before opening into a larger chamber. Carter examined the support beams. "This portion is man-made, early 20th century construction, but look at the tool marks on the wall, they're wrong." Greene moved closer. The cuts in the rock were indeed unusual, too precise, at angles that would be difficult to achieve with conventional mining tools. "They didn't create this tunnel," Carter continued. "They discovered it and expanded it. As they pressed deeper, the man-made elements gradually gave way to something else. The walls became smoother, with occasional sections that appeared almost polished. Strange symbols began to appear, carved into the stone, similar to those Tommy had drawn in his journal, but older, worn by time. "I've seen these before," Greene murmured, tracing a symbol with his fingertip. In Bavaria, during the war, a Nazi research facility had similar markings in the lower levels. "They're everywhere," Tommy said, his voice distant. "All over the world. Doorways, warnings, prayers, the language of the firstborn." Greene and Carter exchanged concerned glances. Tommy's episodes were becoming more frequent, the line between his consciousness and the other presence blurring. The tunnel sloped downward, taking them deeper beneath the earth. The temperature dropped noticeably, their breath fogging in the beam of their flashlights. After nearly 30 minutes of careful descent, they reached a circular chamber with 7 tunnels branching outward, like spokes from a wheel. "Which way?" Greene asked, studying the options. Tommy walked forward as if in a trance, stopping in the center of the chamber. He tilted his head, listening to something only he could hear, then pointed to the 3rd tunnel from the left. "That one leads to the heart." "Tommy," Carter said carefully, "is that you speaking, or?" Tommy's eyes were dilated, but lucid. "Both now. It's getting harder to separate us. But we need to go that way." Greene made the decision. "We stay together. First sign of danger, we retreat." The chosen tunnel was different from the others, wider, taller, with smoother walls covered in more elaborate versions of the symbols they'd seen earlier. As they progressed, Greene noticed a faint luminescence emanating from veins of crystalline material embedded in the rock. The light pulsed subtly, almost like a heartbeat. "Bioluminescence," Carter observed, collecting a small sample in a vial. "But responding to our presence, it's reacting to proximity." An hour into their descent, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern that took their breath away. The ceiling soared at least 100 feet above them, supported by columns that appeared to be a fusion of stalagmites in deliberate construction. The bioluminescent veins were more prevalent here, casting the entire chamber in a pale blue glow that shifted and danced across the rock faces. But what demanded their attention was the structure in the center, a perfect dome perhaps 50 feet in diameter, constructed of the same pearlescent material they'd seen in the crash debris. Its surface rippled gently, responding to the light and perhaps their presence. "My God," Carter whispered, "it's a containment vessel, like the one that crashed, but intact." Tommy stepped forward, drawn to the structure. "Not containment, incubation. They sleep within, dreaming, waiting, have waited for millennia." Greene grabbed his arm. "Who are they, Tommy? What's inside that thing?" Tommy turned to him, tears streaming down his face. "The architects, the firstborn, those who ruled before mankind crawled from the ocean, those who will rule again." Before Greene could respond, the ground trembled beneath their feet. Dust and small rocks showered from the ceiling as a deep vibration resonated through the cavern. "That wasn't natural," Carter said urgently. "That felt like explosives," Greene finished, his military experience recognizing the signature. "Someone's blasting their way in, a different entrance." Tommy's face contorted with fear. "Faulkner, she followed us. She's been planning this, using us to find the heart while her team created another access point." They retreated to the shelter of a rock formation as a section of the far wall collapsed inward. Through the dust and debris emerged figures in hazmat suits, carrying equipment and weapons. Leading them was Agent Faulkner, her expression coldly triumphant as she surveyed the chamber. "Right on schedule," she announced, her voice carrying across the cavern. "Thank you for leading us here, Agent Greene. We've been searching for this chamber for decades." Greene drew his weapon. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Faulkner." She laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally. "On the contrary, we understand exactly what we've found. The power to reshape the world, to control minds, to win any conflict without firing a shot." Her team spread out, setting up equipment around the dome. One group began attaching devices to the surface that appeared designed to cut or penetrate the material. "Don't," Tommy screamed, lunging forward only to be restrained by Greene. "You'll release them before the alignment." The barriers between worlds are still too strong. Faulkner's attention focused on Tommy. Mr. Hayes, our most successful subject. The connection you've established has been invaluable to our research. This isn't research, Carter called out. It's suicide. That structure is containing something our ancestors imprisoned for a reason. Imprisoned, yes, Faulkner agreed. But not by your ancestors, Dr. Carter, by rivals, other entities who feared their power. Humanity was barely sentient when this war was fought. She gestured to the dome. Inside lies the key to harnessing their abilities, a direct neural interface between their consciousness and ours. As she spoke, her team activated their equipment. A high-pitched whine filled the cavern as cutting tools engaged with the dome's surface. The material resisted initially, then began to yield, a viscous fluid seeping from the incision points. Tommy collapsed to his knees, screaming in agony, his hands clutching his head. They're waking, they feel it. The bioluminescent veins pulsed more rapidly, brightening until the cavern was bathed in harsh blue light. The ground trembled continuously now, rocks falling from the ceiling, forcing everyone to seek cover. Faulkner, stop this now, Greene shouted over the din. You're going to kill us all. Faulkner ignored him, watching with fascination as the dome's surface became more fluid, parts of it flowing away from the cuts like mercury. Breakthrough in 30 seconds, one of her technicians announced. Carter had been examining the symbols on the nearby columns, her scientific mind racing to decipher their meaning. Greene, she called urgently, these aren't just decorative, they're a warning. This chamber, it's not just containment, it's a lock, one of several around the world. If they breach that dome... Her words were cut short by a deafening sound, not an explosion, but a sudden absence of sound followed by a pressure wave that knocked everyone off their feet. The dome had ruptured, its surface flowing outward like quicksilver, engulfing two of Faulkner's technicians who screamed briefly before being absorbed into the material. What emerged from within defied comprehension, not a physical entity but a shifting mass of darkness and light, geometries that hurt the human eye to perceive, constantly changing, flowing, adapting. Tendrils of the same material that had composed the dome extended outward, touching the cavern walls, connecting with the bioluminescent veins which pulsed in response. Tommy stood, no longer himself, his eyes completely black, voice resonating with power that didn't belong to him. The awakening begins. The first lock is broken. Soon, all will be free. Several of Faulkner's team dropped their equipment, their expressions going blank before they began moving in unison toward the entity, offering themselves to its touch. Those who resisted found themselves fighting their own bodies, as though their motor control had been hijacked. Greene grabbed Carter's arm. We need to leave, now. The journals, Carter insisted, retrieving Tommy's notebook from where it had fallen. We need evidence, proof of what happened here. As they retreated toward the tunnel entrance, Faulkner appeared before them, blocking their path. But something was wrong. Her movements were jerky, her eyes unfocused. You don't understand, she said, her voice overlaid with another deeper tone. This was always the plan. For centuries we've been guiding humanity, selecting bloodlines, positioning our agents. The Roswell incident was no accident. It was a call, a beacon to those sensitive enough to hear. You've been compromised, Faulkner, Greene said, raising his weapon. Step aside. She smiled, the expression chilling on her normally stoic face. Compromised? No, elevated. What you see happening here is transcendence, evolution, the next step for humanity. Behind her, the entity continued to expand, filling more of the chamber, absorbing Faulkner's willing team members. Each consumption added to its mass, its complexity, its awareness. Greene made a decision he would later question endlessly. He fired, the bullet striking Faulkner in the shoulder, spinning her aside. He grabbed Carter and they ran, leaving Tommy behind, his form already merging with the growing entity. The journey back through the tunnels was a nightmare of confusion and terror. The bioluminescent veins pulsed frantically, the light almost blinding. The air grew thick, hard to breathe, carrying whispers that seemed to come from the stone itself. Twice they took wrong turns, finding themselves in chambers they hadn't seen before, filled with artifacts of non-human design and purpose. Finally, they emerged into the desert night, gasping for fresh air, legs trembling from exertion and fear. The mine entrance behind them glowed with unnatural light, a beacon in the darkness. "We need to collapse it," Greene decided, looking back at the pulsing light. "Seal it again." Carter shook her head. "It won't help. That was just one chamber, one lock. There are others all over the world. And now that the first is open, the rest will be easier to find, easier to breach." In the distance they could see vehicles approaching, military by the look of them, summoned by Faulkner's team before everything went wrong. "They can't be allowed near that mine," Greene said. "Whatever's in there, it can control minds, hijack bodies, if it reaches someone with military authority." "We run," Carter said simply. "We take the evidence, go public. It's the only way." Greene nodded grimly. "The truck's still here. We can reach the state line before dawn if we hurry." As they sped away from the site, Greene glanced in the rearview mirror. The glow from the mine shaft had intensified, a pillar of blue-white light now reaching toward the stars, and silhouetted against it was a figure he recognized as Tommy Hayes, or what Tommy Hayes had become, watching their departure with ancient, patient eyes. The entity had awakened, and humanity's reign was approaching its end. 3 weeks after their escape from the mine shaft, Greene and Carter found themselves in a seedy motel on the outskirts of Chicago, far from the expanding zone of strange occurrences centered on Roswell. They'd been on the move constantly, staying one step ahead of government agents and something worse, people with blank expressions and overly precise movements who appeared in every city they visited. The small room was covered in maps, newspaper clippings, and pages from Tommy's journal. They'd been connecting the dots, finding patterns in seemingly unrelated events across the country. Mental health facilities reporting unprecedented increases in patients experiencing the same delusions. Geological anomalies, power outages following unusual electromagnetic patterns. "It's spreading," Carter said, circling another location on the map, a small town in Montana where an entire church congregation had walked into the wilderness one Sunday morning, never to return. "Faster than I anticipated." Greene stared at a newspaper article about unusual behavior among military personnel at a base near the original crash site. "They're building something, converting the underground missile silos into something else." Carter nodded grimly. "The entity needs physical infrastructure, a network to expand its influence beyond direct contact. It's using human hosts to create it." Their research had yielded disturbing revelations. What they'd encountered wasn't a single entity but a collective consciousness. Ancient beings that had once dominated Earth before being imprisoned in pocket dimensions by forces unknown. The crash in Roswell had been a partial breach, a tendril of their consciousness testing the barriers. What Faulkner's team had done was tear those barriers open completely. A knock at the door froze them both. Greene drew his weapon while Carter quickly gathered their most crucial documents. They'd established protocols for emergency evacuation, separate routes. A knock at the door froze them both. Greene drew his weapon while Carter quickly gathered their most crucial documents. They'd established protocols for emergency evacuation, separate routes, different destinations, plans to reconnect once the immediate threat passed. Greene approached the door cautiously, positioning himself to the side. "Who is it?" "Daniel Cooper, Chicago Tribune," came the reply. "I got your message." Greene and Carter exchanged glances. They'd reached out to select journalists, looking for allies who might help bring the truth to light. Still, caution was necessary. "Slip your press credentials under the door," Greene instructed. A moment later, a press badge appeared. Greene examined it closely. It appeared genuine, but that meant little these days. He unlocked the door, keeping his weapon ready. The man who entered was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades chasing stories. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Greene's gun but showed no fear. "You said you had evidence of government experiments gone wrong," Cooper said, getting straight to business. "Something connected to Roswell." "It's more complicated than that," Carter replied, assessing him carefully. "What do you know about the recent incidents, the mass disappearances, the spike in mental health crises?" Cooper set his briefcase on the bed and opened it, retrieving a stack of manila folders. "Been tracking them for months. Started as local stories. nothing connecting them except a pattern I couldn't quite name. He spread photographs across the bed, aerial views of construction sites, people with vacant expressions walking in perfect unison, geological surveys showing impossible underground formations. "You've been busy," Greene observed, lowering his weapon slightly. "I was in Vietnam," Cooper explained. "Saw things the military didn't want reported. Developed a nose for when I'm being fed bullshit. This Roswell weather balloon story stank from day one." Carter leafed through his research, impressed despite herself. "You've identified 3 of the 7 sites we've confirmed. Did you connect them to the original crash?" Cooper nodded. "Took me a while, but yes, whatever fell in Roswell wasn't the beginning, it was a catalyst. There's evidence of government interest in these sites going back decades." Greene decided to take a risk. He handed Cooper Tommy's journal. This belonged to the first witness at the crash site. It documents his mental deterioration and the visions he experienced after contact with the material. Cooper flipped through the pages, his journalistic detachment slipping as he absorbed the disturbing images and increasingly fractured entries. "Jesus," he muttered, "and you've verified this, not the ravings of a schizophrenic." "We've seen it ourselves," Carter said quietly. 3 weeks ago, at an abandoned mineshaft 30 miles from Roswell, we witnessed a government team led by Agent Faulkner intentionally release whatever was contained there. For the next hour, they shared everything: the nature of the entity, its ability to influence and eventually control human minds, the government's misguided attempt to harness its power, and the accelerating pattern of incidents suggesting a coordinated effort to establish a global network. Cooper took meticulous notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly listening with growing horror. Finally, he set his notepad down. "You realize how this sounds," he said. "Completely insane," Greene acknowledged. "We're aware. Yet you have documentation, physical evidence, and corroborating incidents across multiple states." Cooper rubbed his temples. "My editor will never run this." "We don't need a front-page story," Carter explained. "We need access to government records. There's a facility, Blackwood Complex, located beneath the Sandia Mountains in New Mexico. According to documents we've obtained, it's been operating since the early 1940s, researching ways to weaponize non-human consciousness." Cooper's expression changed. "Blackwood. I've heard whispers about that place from military sources. Supposedly it's where they send scientists who've developed concerning ideas." "We need to get inside," Greene said bluntly. "Everything points to Blackwood as the center of this operation. Whatever Faulkner's people released is being channeled there, studied, and potentially amplified." Cooper closed his briefcase. "I might be able to help. I have a contact, former military, worked security at a place he would never name but described in ways that match your Blackwood. He's been trying to get someone to listen to his stories for years." "Is he trustworthy?" Greene asked. "As much as anyone these days," Cooper replied. "But he's scared, drinks too much. Whatever he saw in that place broke something in him." They agreed to meet Cooper's contact the following evening. As the journalist left, Carter turned to Greene, her expression troubled. "We're running out of time," she said softly. "The spread is accelerating. Those incidents we tracked last week, 17 new ones reported yesterday alone." Greene nodded grimly. "If Cooper's contact can get us into Blackwood, we might have a chance. If not..." He didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew the alternative, a world slowly falling under the influence of a consciousness so alien, so ancient, that humanity was little more than insects to it. Cooper's contact turned out to be a man named Harrington, former special forces who'd been discharged under circumstances he refused to discuss. They met in the basement of an abandoned warehouse, Harrington insisting on a location with no electronic surveillance. "Blackwood," he said, the word emerging as barely more than a whisper. His hands trembled as he poured whiskey from a flask into a paper cup. 19 years, I've tried to forget that place." "We need to know everything," Greene pressed. "Layout, security, access points." Harrington laughed bitterly. "You don't access Blackwood. Blackwood accesses you." He saw their confusion and continued. The place isn't just physically secure, it gets inside your head. Guards, scientists, subjects, everyone there is changed by it. You start hearing things, seeing things. They tell you it's stress, give you pills. The pills make it worse. The entity, Carter murmured. They've been experimenting with it for decades. Harrington's eyes widened. You know about it, the thing in the chambers, the thing they talk to. We've seen it, Greene confirmed. We know what it can do. Something in Harrington seemed to break. He began speaking rapidly, describing the underground complex in detail, 5 levels descending into the mountain, each with specific functions. Administration near the surface, followed by conventional research laboratories, then containment facilities for test subjects, and finally on the deepest level, the chambers where the primary specimens were housed. Nothing human down there, Harrington muttered. Nothing that ever was human. He provided entry codes, security protocols, and the location of a service tunnel that could bypass most of the security checkpoints. The information spilled from him like poison from a wound, details he'd suppressed for nearly 2 decades emerging with perfect clarity. They're planning something, he said finally, something big. Last month, my old commander contacted me, Jenkins. He was stationed at Blackwood when I was, said they were awakening the asset, said it was happening everywhere, all at once. When? Greene demanded. Soon, days, maybe. There's a sequence they're following, locations activated, in a specific order, creating a network. Harrington's eyes were haunted. Jenkins killed himself the next day, left a note saying it was the only way to be sure. With Harrington's information, they formulated a plan. Cooper would use his press connections to create a diversion at the main entrance, while Greene and Carter infiltrated through the service tunnel. Their goal was simple but daunting: reach the lowest level, document everything, and escape with evidence that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. 2 days later, as sunset painted the Sandia Mountains in shades of purple and gold, they put their plan into action. Cooper's diversion, a press conference announcing a major expose on waste and corruption in military spending, drew security resources to the facility's public-facing entrance. Greene and Carter, equipped with Harrington's access codes and a backpack full of camera equipment, located the service tunnel entrance disguised as a maintenance shed for the nearby rail line. The codes worked, the door sliding open to reveal a narrow concrete tunnel illuminated by widely spaced emergency lighting. If Harrington's information is correct, this will take us to the 3rd level, Carter said as they moved cautiously forward. From there, we'll need to find the central elevator shaft. The tunnel stretched before them, descending at a gentle angle. The air grew cooler, carrying a faint metallic tang similar to what they'd experienced in the mine shaft. As they progressed, Greene noticed Carter repeatedly checking her watch. Something wrong? He asked. She hesitated. The timing of all this, the entity's awakening, the network activation Harrington mentioned. I've been analyzing the pattern of incidents, correlating them with astronomical data. And there's an alignment happening, celestial bodies moving into positions that occur only once every few thousand years. If my calculations are correct, it reaches its peak in less than 6 hours. Greene absorbed this. So whatever they're planning at Blackwood is linked to this alignment. Yes, the ancient cultures that left warnings about these entities, they all included astronomical markers, dates when the barriers between dimensions would be thinnest. After 20 minutes of careful progress, they reached a security door marked Level 3, Authorized Personnel Only. Greene entered the code Harrington had provided, and the door unlocked with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The contrast with the crude tunnel was stark. Beyond the door lay a pristine white corridor with recessed lighting and doors at regular intervals. Everything was immaculate, sterile, with the antiseptic smell of a hospital. But beneath that clinical exterior, Greene detected something else. A subtle wrongness in the architecture, angles that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, shadows that moved independently of their sources. Observation rooms, Carter whispered, peering through a small window in one of the doors. Inside was a Spartan chamber with a bed, desk, and monitoring equipment. This is where they keep test subjects. Most of the rooms were empty, but in a few, they glimpsed people sitting motionless on beds or standing in corners, facing the walls. None responded to their presence, even when Greene tapped lightly on the glass. They're connected to it, Carter realized. Conduits, their minds are elsewhere. At the end of the corridor, they found what they were looking for, a service elevator requiring both keycard and code access. Greene used the credentials Harrington had provided, and the elevator doors slid open silently. Only goes down from here, Greene noted, examining the control panel. No access to upper levels. Carter nodded. They compartmentalize, keep the research teams separated. Most of the scientists on the upper levels probably have no idea what's happening down below. The elevator descended smoothly, the digital display tracking their progress. Level 4, then 5. Then, unexpectedly, it continued. 6, 7, 8. Harrington said there were only 5 levels, Greene said, tension evident in his voice. He wasn't cleared for the lower levels, Carter replied grimly. Nobody was supposed to know about them. The elevator finally stopped at level 8, nearly a mile beneath the surface. When the doors opened, they were hit by a wall of humid, warm air carrying an organic smell, not unpleasant but decidedly non-human. They stepped into a circular chamber that served as a hub for several branching corridors. The architecture here was entirely different, flowing, organic lines rather than rigid geometry. The walls themselves seemed almost alive, with subtle patterns that moved beneath the surface. This wasn't built by humans, Carter whispered, running her hand along a wall. The material felt warm, yielding slightly to pressure before firming again. This is their architecture. Greene checked his watch. We have less than an hour before Cooper's diversion ends. We need to move quickly. They chose the largest corridor, following it as it curved gently downward. The lighting here came from the walls themselves, a soft bioluminescence similar to what they'd seen in the mine shaft. As they progressed, they began to hear a sound, a low, rhythmic pulsing that they felt in their bodies as much as heard with their ears. The corridor opened into a vast chamber that took their breath away. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet above them, supported by twisting columns that resembled enormous vertebrae. The floor descended in concentric circles toward a central pit from which emanated a brilliant blue-white light. Surrounding the pit were workstations filled with both conventional human technology and devices of unknown design and purpose. Most shocking, however, were the people. Dozens of scientists and military personnel moved about the chamber, but their movements were wrong, too fluid, too coordinated, as though they were parts of a single organism rather than individuals. None spoke, yet they worked in perfect synchronization. They're all connected, Carter whispered, a hive mind. At the edge of the pit stood a familiar figure, Agent Faulkner. She was changed from when they'd last seen her. Her posture was different, her movements graceful and precise in a way that seemed beyond human capability. As if sensing their presence, she turned, her eyes finding them immediately across the vast chamber. Dr. Carter, Agent Greene, she called, her voice carrying effortlessly, right on schedule. The workers nearest to Greene and Carter turned as one, moving to surround them with the unhurried confidence of predators who know their prey cannot escape. Don't bother running, Faulkner continued, approaching. The facility is sealed. Besides, you're here for answers, aren't you? Come, see what you helped create. Greene drew his weapon, but Faulkner merely smiled. That won't be necessary, Agent Greene. If we wanted you dead, you wouldn't have made it past the surface. With limited options, they allowed themselves to be escorted toward the central pit. As they drew closer, the light grew more intense, pulsing in time with the rhythmic sound that filled the chamber. At the edge of the pit, Greene and Carter looked down into a sight that defied comprehension. The pit descended at least 100 feet, its walls lined with the same organic material as the rest of the level. At the bottom, suspended in a field of energy, was an object, or entity, that constantly shifted between states of matter. At times it appeared solid, a crystalline structure of impossible complexity. Then it would flow like liquid, or disperse like gas, never settling into a single form. Beautiful, isn't it? Faulkner said, genuine awe in her voice. The architects of reality, the firstborn of this world. What have you done? Carter asked, unable to tear her eyes from the hypnotic movements of the entity. Not me, Faulkner replied. Us, humanity, for centuries we've been working toward this moment, the awakening, the reconnection. Most didn't know what they served, of course, but those of us with the genetic markers, the sensitivity, we always felt their call. Genetic markers, Greene questioned. Faulkner nodded. Certain bloodlines carry traces of their influence. People with the markers are drawn to places of power, to positions of influence. I'm one. So is Dr. Carter, though she doesn't realize it yet. Why do you think she's been so successful in understanding their biology? It's in her DNA. Carter stepped back, horrified. That's not true. Test yourself, Faulkner challenged. The sensitivity manifests in dreams first, then intuitive leaps in research, then finally direct communication. Haven't you felt it? The whispers at the edge of consciousness, the solutions that come to you fully formed in moments of quiet. Greene interjected. Whatever you think you're communicating with, it's using you. The entity doesn't care about humanity. Faulkner laughed, the sound echoing strangely. Of course it doesn't care about humanity as we are now. We're incomplete, unfinished. What's happening here isn't an invasion, it's completion. Evolution directed by the original engineers of life on Earth. She gestured to the workers moving throughout the chamber. These are the first to undergo the transformation. Their individual consciousness has been networked, connected to the central mind. They're more than they were, not less. They're slaves, Greene countered. They're transcendent, Faulkner corrected. Free from the isolation of individual consciousness, the loneliness of separate minds. They experience reality as it was meant to be experienced, as a collective, sharing every sensation, every thought. As she spoke, Greene noticed something disturbing. The workers nearest to them had begun to change physically, subtle at first, elongated fingers, eyes growing larger and darker, skin taking on a faint luminescence. The alignment approaches, Faulkner continued, checking a device on her wrist that resembled a watch but displayed symbols rather than numbers. When it peaks, the barriers between dimensions will thin enough for full manifestation. What you see here is merely an aspect, a fragment of their true form. Carter had been studying the equipment surrounding the pit. You're amplifying it, she realized, using technology to strengthen its influence. Precisely, Faulkner confirmed. The network is global now, 7 primary nodes, hundreds of secondary relays, all channeling consciousness toward a single point. Here, Greene's mind raced, searching for options. And Tommy Hayes, what happened to him? A flicker of something, regret, perhaps, crossed Faulkner's face. Mr. Hayes was instrumental in locating the primary node. His sensitivity was off the charts, a perfect receiver. He has been integrated. His consciousness forms part of the interface now. You mean he's dead? Greene said flatly. Death is a limited concept, Faulkner replied. He exists in a state beyond individual life or death. In many ways, he's more alive now than ever before. As they spoke, the pulsing light from the pit intensified. The entity at the bottom began moving more rapidly, its transformations accelerating. Throughout the chamber, the workers stopped their activities, turning as one toward the pit. It's starting, Faulkner said, her voice hushed with reverence. The final phase of awakening. The ground beneath them trembled, not with the violence of an earthquake, but with a gentle, rhythmic motion like the breathing of some enormous organism. The walls of the chamber seemed to ripple in response, the patterns within them flowing more rapidly. Greene, Carter whispered urgently, the cameras, we need evidence. Greene nodded subtly, reaching for the backpack. Faulkner made no move to stop him as he retrieved a digital camera, her attention fixed on the pit and the transforming entity within it. Record everything, she said, surprising them. Be witnesses to the rebirth. When it's complete, you'll understand. You'll join us willingly. The confidence in her voice was chilling. Greene began filming, capturing the impossible scene before them, the pit, the entity, the transformed workers who now stood with arms outstretched toward the central light, their bodies undergoing accelerated changes. Carter moved carefully toward one of the workstations, examining the displays and controls. Most showed readings that meant nothing to her, but some contained recognizable data: electromagnetic field measurements, radiation levels, brainwave patterns from test subjects. The interface works both ways, she realized, studying the information. It's not just receiving consciousness from the entity, it's feeding human consciousness into it. Faulkner nodded approvingly. You understand quickly, Dr. Carter. The merger requires exchange, a blending of our awareness with theirs. For millennia they've been studying us through dreams, through moments of inspiration mistaken for creativity. Now we complete the circle. By sacrificing humanity, Greene said. By elevating it, Faulkner corrected. Humanity's greatest flaw is its isolation, minds trapped in separate bodies, unable to truly know one another. This ends that separation forever. As she spoke, the light from the pit flared blindingly. The entity within it rose, suspended in the air, its form shifting more rapidly between states. The workers surrounding the pit began a low, harmonious humming that resonated with the pulsing sound emanating from the entity. Faulkner closed her eyes, her expression one of ecstasy. The alignment peaks. The gateway opens. Carter, still at the workstation, had noticed something crucial: a containment system regulating the entity's connection to the outer world. If disrupted, it might not destroy the entity, but it could interrupt whatever process was occurring. Greene, she said quietly, catching his attention. She nodded subtly toward the control panel, her intention clear. Greene understood immediately. As Faulkner and the others focused on the pit, he positioned himself near Carter, continuing to film while she studied the controls. The convergence is at 20%, Faulkner announced. Neural patterns synchronizing, dimensional barriers thinning. Greene watched in horror as the entity continued to rise from the pit, expanding as it did so. Its outer edges now reached the rim, tendrils of its substance extending toward the nearest workers, who accepted its touch willingly. Where it made contact, their bodies began to change more dramatically, limbs elongating, features shifting, skin taking on the same pearlescent quality as the entity itself. 50%, Faulkner continued, her voice changing, deepening, overlaid with harmonic tones that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. The network activates worldwide. Carter had identified the critical systems. When I give the signal, she whispered to Greene, be ready to run, head for the service elevator. Greene nodded, continuing to document everything on camera. What about you? I'll be right behind you, but someone needs to make sure this gets out, no matter what. The implications were clear. If only one of them escaped, it had to be with the evidence. Greene hated the plan but couldn't argue with its logic. 70%, Faulkner announced. Her own transformation had begun, her skin glowing from within, eyes enlarging and darkening until they were black pools that reflected the light from the pit. The final barriers dissolve. Carter positioned her hand over what appeared to be an emergency shutdown sequence. Now, she shouted, simultaneously entering the command and pulling a fire alarm on the wall beside her. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The containment field around the entity flickered and collapsed. Alarms blared throughout the chamber as emergency protocols activated. The entity, suddenly unrestrained, surged upward with impossible speed, parts of it dispersing into a mist that filled the air while its core maintained cohesion. No, Faulkner screamed, her voice no longer human. The sequence is incomplete. The transformed workers responded to the disruption with varying degrees of confusion, some collapsing to the ground, others moving erratically, a few turning on each other with sudden violence. Run, Carter yelled, pushing Greene toward the corridor they'd entered through. Greene clutched the camera, backing away as chaos erupted around them. The entity continued to expand, filling more of the chamber, but its movements seemed uncoordinated now, reactive rather than purposeful. Faulkner turned toward them, rage distorting her half-transformed features. You cannot stop what has already begun, she roared, her voice reverberating with power that made the air itself vibrate. Greene and Carter fled down the corridor, the sounds of destruction following them. The organic architecture of the level had begun to respond to the entity's distress, walls pulsing rapidly, the bioluminescence flaring to painful brightness, then dimming to near darkness in irregular patterns. They reached the service elevator, Carter frantically entering the override code Harrington had provided for emergencies. The doors slid open, and they stumbled inside, punching the button for the surface level. As the doors closed, they caught a final glimpse of the corridor behind them. The walls were rippling violently now, the material flowing like wax. And at the far end, a figure appeared. Faulkner, or what remained of her form elongated and fluid, moving with inhuman speed toward them. The doors sealed shut just as she reached them, her transformed hands leaving molten impressions in the metal as the elevator began its ascent. "Will that hold her?" Greene asked, breathing heavily. Carter shook her head. "I don't know. Nothing about this follows conventional physics, but the containment protocols might slow the entity's spread." The elevator rose rapidly, the digital display tracking their progress back through the levels. The camera in Greene's hands contained the only evidence of what lay beneath the Sandia Mountains, proof of a conspiracy spanning decades and a threat to humanity's very existence. "What happens now?" Greene asked as the elevator passed level 3. "We disrupted the alignment, but the entity is still free, still spreading." Carter's expression was grim. "We bought time, nothing more. The containment systems will eventually fail. When they do." She didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what awaited the world if the entity fully manifested. Not destruction, but something far worse. A transformation of consciousness, the end of humanity as independent beings. As the elevator approached the surface level, they prepared themselves for whatever awaited them above. The evidence they carried had to reach the public, had to be believed. It was humanity's only chance, a slim hope that awareness might somehow lead to resistance. The elevator slowed, then stopped. The doors opened to reveal the simple concrete tunnel through which they'd entered, now bathed in flashing red emergency lights. In the distance, they could hear alarms and the sound of voices shouting orders. "Cooper should be waiting with a car on the south side," Greene said, checking his watch, "if he followed the plan." They moved quickly through the tunnel, the sense of pursuit constant though nothing visible followed them. The air itself seemed charged, hostile, as though the entity's influence permeated even this far from its source. When they reached the hidden entrance, they found it sealed. Emergency protocols had locked down the facility. Greene frantically tried Harrington's override codes, but the system remained unresponsive. "There has to be another way out," Carter insisted, examining the walls for signs of alternative exits. Greene studied the control panel more carefully. "This isn't an electronic lock," he realized. "It's biomechanical, like the technology we saw below." Carter understood immediately. "It's responding to the entity's influence. We need to trigger its recognition systems." She placed her hand on the panel, closing her eyes in concentration. For several tense moments, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the panel began to glow with the same bioluminescence they'd seen in the lower levels. "Carter," Greene said warily, "what are you doing?" Her eyes opened, and for a moment, Greene thought he saw something in them, a flicker of darkness, gone so quickly he couldn't be certain it was ever there. "Improvising," she said as the door slid open. "Faulkner was right about one thing. I do have a sensitivity. I felt it when we were in the chamber, a connection trying to establish itself." Greene backed away slightly. "Are you?" "Still me," she assured him. "For now, but we need to move quickly. I can feel it searching, reaching through the network. It knows what we've done." They emerged into the cool night air, the stars above obscured by clouds that seemed to have gathered only over the facility. In the distance they could see emergency vehicles, their lights cutting through the darkness as personnel responded to the breach. "Southside," Greene reminded her, and they set off, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the floodlights that now swept the perimeter. Cooper was where he promised to be, his car idling on a service road half a mile from the main facility. His eyes widened as they approached, taking in their disheveled appearance and the tension evident in their movements. "Jesus, what happened down there?" he asked as they climbed into the car. "Drive," Greene ordered. "Get us away from here. I'll explain when we're safe." Cooper pulled away, taking a circuitous route to avoid security checkpoints. In the back seat, Carter sat unnaturally still, her gaze fixed on something distant and invisible. "Carter," Greene said, reaching for her hand. "Stay with me." She turned to him, a fragile smile on her lips. "It's still spreading," she whispered. "I can feel it. The disruption only slowed the process, didn't stop it. They'll find another way to complete the alignment." "What did you see?" Cooper asked, glancing at them in the rearview mirror. "What's in that place?" Greene held up the camera. "Everything. The truth about Roswell, about the government's decades-long experiment with something ancient and non-human, about a plan to transform humanity into a networked consciousness under the control of entities that once ruled Earth." Cooper's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "And you have proof. Actual, verifiable proof." "Enough to break the story wide open," Greene confirmed. "But we need to move quickly. They'll be hunting us with everything they have." "I have connections," Cooper said. "People who can get information out, make it public before it can be suppressed. But they'll need to authenticate the evidence, verify it's not a hoax." Carter spoke again, her voice oddly distant. "It won't be enough. The entity is adaptable, patient. It's been influencing human development for millennia. Even if the world believes us, the transformation has already begun in too many places." Greene squeezed her hand. "Then we fight it however we can. Warn people about the symptoms, the signs of influence. Find others like Harrington who've seen the truth and escaped." As they drove through the night, putting distance between themselves and Blackwood Complex, none of them noticed the subtle patterns forming in the clouds above, geometric shapes that appeared and disappeared too quickly for conscious recognition, but which imprinted themselves on the subconscious mind, preparing it for what was to come. The entity had awakened, and though its emergence had been temporarily disrupted, its influence continued to spread through channels both seen and unseen. The transformation of humanity had begun, and time was running out. 6 months after their escape from Blackwood Complex, the world Greene and Carter had known was slipping away, transforming so gradually that most people didn't notice until it was too late. Their evidence had reached the public through Cooper's connections, creating a brief media sensation before being systematically discredited by experts with impressive credentials and compelling counter-arguments. Those who believed them were dismissed as conspiracy theorists. Those who actively supported them began to disappear, one by one, leaving behind confusion and carefully constructed explanations for their absences. Greene, Carter, and Cooper had gone underground, establishing a network of resistors, people who recognized the entity's influence and sought ways to combat it. They operated from an abandoned mining facility in the Appalachian Mountains, converted into a makeshift headquarters with equipment salvaged from sympathetic scientists and military personnel. Carter had changed the most in the intervening months. Her sensitivity to the entity had grown, allowing her to detect its presence but also leaving her vulnerable to its influence. She experienced periods of dissociation, moments when her consciousness seemed to merge with the broader network the entity was establishing. These episodes provided valuable intelligence but took a physical toll, each one leaving her weaker, more drained. "They're accelerating the program," she announced, emerging from one such episode. Her voice was hoarse, her skin pale and clammy. "The next alignment is in 2 days, Halloween night." Greene helped her to a chair, offering water which she accepted gratefully. Around them, the command center buzzed with activity as their team of 20 analysts and operators monitored reports from field agents scattered across the country. "Where?" Greene asked, already dreading the answer. "Everywhere," Carter replied grimly. "They've established secondary nodes in major population centers: New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Washington, D.C. When the alignment peaks, they'll activate simultaneously." Cooper approached, tablet in hand. "We're seeing increased activity at all the locations you identified. Unusual construction projects, power grid modifications, population behavior anomalies." He showed them footage of crowds moving through city streets with the same eerie synchronization they'd witnessed at Blackwood. People walking in perfect unison, faces devoid of expression. "It's happening faster than we predicted," Greene observed. "The influence is spreading exponentially." "Mass media is the vector," Carter explained. "They've infiltrated broadcasting networks, inserted subliminal patterns into everything from television programs to internet content. Each exposure weakens natural resistance to the entity's influence." Their operation had identified several key components of the entity's strategy. First, the corruption of influential individuals in government, business, and media. People placed in positions to facilitate the transformation without drawing attention. Second, the establishment of physical infrastructure, specialized equipment disguised as telecommunications upgrades or scientific research installations. Finally, the gradual preparation of the human mind through carefully designed sensory inputs that bypassed conscious awareness. What about the resistance cells? Greene asked, turning to their operations map where pins indicated confirmed groups fighting the entity's influence. Cooper shook his head. We've lost contact with Dallas and Seattle. Boston reports increased surveillance. London says their government contacts have gone silent. The resistance operated on a simple principle. The entity's influence could be temporarily blocked by certain frequencies, materials, and mental techniques. They developed devices that generated electromagnetic fields tuned to disrupt the connection between the entity and human minds. These provided a measure of protection within limited areas, but couldn't be scaled to shield entire populations. We need to target the nodes, Greene decided. Simultaneous strikes at each activation point, just like we did at Blackwood. Carter's expression was doubtful. They'll be expecting that. Security will be impenetrable. Not if we have inside help, Cooper interjected. Our recruitment efforts have been paying off. We have sympathizers in 4 of the 5 major nodes, people who haven't been fully compromised and recognize what's happening. Greene studied the map, considering their limited resources. We focus on the primary node then, the one replacing Blackwood. If we can disrupt that, it might destabilize the entire network. Carter nodded slowly. Our intelligence suggests they've relocated the primary operation to a facility beneath Denver International Airport. The construction has been ongoing for decades, disguised as mundane infrastructure projects. Denver makes sense, Cooper added. Central location, major transportation hub, access to military installations. The airport itself sits on a natural electromagnetic anomaly that would amplify the entity's influence. They began formulating a plan, gathering intelligence from their field agents and analyzing security protocols around the Denver facility. As they worked, Greene couldn't help noticing Carter's deteriorating condition. Each episode left her more connected to the entity but also more fragile, caught between 2 forms of consciousness fighting for dominance. Late that night, he found her alone in the monitoring room, staring at screens displaying news broadcasts from around the world. To the casual observer, the reports showed normal events, weather, politics, entertainment, but Carter had trained herself to see the patterns hidden within the images and sound, subliminal signals embedding themselves in the viewer's subconscious. Late that night, he found her alone in the monitoring room, staring at screens displaying news broadcasts from around the world. To the casual observer, the reports showed normal events, weather, politics, entertainment, but Carter had trained herself to see the patterns hidden within the images and sound, subliminal signals embedding themselves in the viewer's subconscious. Can't sleep? Greene asked, setting a cup of coffee beside her. She accepted it gratefully. Every time I close my eyes, I see their world, their dimension. It's beautiful in a terrible way. Geometries that can't exist in our reality, colors we don't have names for. Greene sat beside her. You're fighting it better than anyone. Tommy Hayes succumbed within weeks. You've held out 6 months. I'm not fighting it well enough, she admitted. Each time I connect, it becomes harder to disconnect completely. Parts of me stay there, in their consciousness, and parts of them stay in mine. She turned to him, eyes haunted. I'm afraid, Samuel. Afraid that by the time we reach Denver, there won't be enough of Evelyn Carter left to help you. Greene took her hand, noting how cold her skin felt. Then we go tomorrow, before the alignment. Hit them while they're still preparing. She nodded slowly. There's something else you should know. When I connect, I can sense Tommy Hayes. He's still in there, still conscious in some way, but he's not the only one. There are thousands now, maybe millions, their individual minds networked into a collective consciousness, and at the center of it all, Faulkner. Greene finished for her. What's left of her, Carter confirmed. She's become something else, a conduit, an interface between the entity and humanity. She guides the transformation, directs the network. If we can reach her, disrupt her connection to the central node, we might be able to destabilize the entire system, Greene realized. Their plan crystallized around this new information. A small strike team would infiltrate the Denver facility, targeting the central node and Faulkner herself. The resistance would coordinate diversionary actions at the secondary nodes, spreading the entity's attention and resources thin. By dawn, they were ready. Their team consisted of Greene, Carter, Cooper, and 3 former Special Forces operators who had witnessed the entity's influence firsthand during classified operations. They carried equipment designed to disrupt the entity's electromagnetic signatures and weapons that, in theory, could affect both physical and non-physical manifestations. Remember, Greene told the team during their final briefing, what we're facing doesn't fully exist in our reality. Conventional weapons may be useless against certain aspects of it. That's why each of you has been equipped with the disruptor devices Dr. Carter designed. The devices, compact units generating specific frequency patterns, were the result of Carter's unique understanding of the entity's nature. They created a localized field that temporarily severed the connection between the entity and human consciousness, providing a window of clarity for those partially under its influence. Their journey to Denver was tense, avoiding main routes and checkpoints where the entity's influence might be strongest. They observed the subtle signs of transformation spreading across the country, people moving with uncanny coordination, construction projects advancing with impossible speed, communication systems being modified in ways that made no logical sense unless viewed as components of a larger, hidden network. They reached Denver as sunset painted the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The airport stood on the eastern plains, its distinctive white tensile roof structures resembling mountain peaks, or, as some had noted years before its true purpose was understood, ceremonial tents from some ancient ritual. Using credentials provided by their inside contact, they gained access to a maintenance area beneath the main terminal. The facility below was far more extensive than the public imagined, level after level descending into the earth, each more secure than the last. The central node is at the lowest level, Carter whispered as they navigated through service corridors, avoiding security personnel whose synchronized movements betrayed their connection to the entity. I can feel it pulling at me, trying to establish connection. Greene noticed her speech patterns changing subtly, becoming more formal, precise. The entity's influence was growing stronger as they descended. "Stay with me, Evelyn," he said, using her first name deliberately to reinforce her human identity. "Focus on why we're here." They encountered their first real resistance at a security checkpoint 3 levels down. The guards moved with inhuman coordination, anticipating their approach before they came into view. The disruptor devices proved effective but had limited range. They needed to get close to use them, exposing themselves to danger. During the brief but intense confrontation, one of their team members was lost, touched by a guard whose fingers elongated upon contact, merging with the operative's flesh. The transformation was horrifyingly swift, their allies' features melting and reforming into something no longer recognizable as human before Greene could put him down with a shot to the head. "They're adapting to our disruptors," Carter observed, her scientific mind still analyzing despite the horror of their situation. "Each exposure teaches them how to counter the frequencies." They pressed on, descending further. The architecture changed gradually, sterile government facility giving way to the organic, flowing designs they had seen at Blackwood. The walls pulsed with bioluminescence, responding to their presence with patterns that hurt the eyes and induced vertigo in those who looked too long. Cooper, monitoring communications through a specialized headset, suddenly tensed. Something's happening on the surface. News feeds are going haywire, some kind of announcement being broadcast globally. Greene checked his watch. The alignment's not for another 12 hours. They're moving early. "Or this is preparation," Carter suggested, softening the collective consciousness, making it receptive. At the 5th level down, they encountered something unexpected, a massive chamber filled with rows of clear cylindrical tanks, each containing a human form suspended in fluid. Some were recognizably human, others partially transformed with elongated limbs, altered facial features, translucent skin revealing modified internal structures. Incubation chambers, Carter explained, her voice hollow. They're accelerating the physical transformation in selected subjects, creating interfaces, bodies capable of channeling greater portions of the entity's consciousness into our reality. Cooper moved closer to one of the tanks, examining the occupant. My God, this one's just a child. Younger minds are more adaptable, Carter said mechanically, then shook her head violently as if trying to dislodge the thought. No, that's not me, that's it, thinking through me. Greene took her arm. We need to keep moving. The central node is what matters. As they continued their descent, the final level opened before them. A vast cathedral-like space carved from the living rock. Unlike Blackwood's chamber, this one showed evidence of deliberate design. Ancient symbols covering every surface, arrangements of crystals and metals forming patterns that corresponded to astronomical alignments. And at the center, a pit similar to what they'd seen before, but immeasurably larger. The entity within it had grown, its constantly shifting form now filling the massive depression and extending tendrils up the sides like a living tree seeking light. Standing on a platform extending over the pit was Faulkner, or what remained of her. Her transformation was complete. Her body no longer remotely human. She had become a living conduit. Her form elongated and fluid, skin translucent and glowing with internal light, limbs numbering more than 4 and moving with impossible grace. Surrounding her were dozens of partially transformed humans, their movements synchronized with hers, forming a living computer processing the entity's will and translating it into actions across the global network. Carter gasped, doubling over as if struck. The connection, it's so strong here, I can feel it pulling at my mind. Greene activated his disruptor to maximum power, creating a protective field around them. Cooper set the charges, focus on the support structures and the equipment surrounding the pit. Their plan was simple but desperate. Plant explosive devices at critical points, disrupting the physical infrastructure supporting the entity's manifestation, then escape before detonation. With the primary node destabilized, the secondary nodes might fail to activate properly during the alignment. But Faulkner had sensed their presence. She turned toward them, her movements liquid and graceful, eyes that were now just pools of luminescent fluid fixing on them with terrible recognition. Agent Greene, she said, her voice a harmonic chorus rather than a single sound. Dr. Carter, we've been expecting you. Greene raised his weapon, knowing it was likely useless but unwilling to surrender without a fight. This ends now, Faulkner. Whatever you think you're creating, it's not evolution, it's extinction. Extinction is a limited concept, Faulkner replied, echoing her words from Blackwood. What dies is the isolation of individual consciousness. What emerges is unity, connection, the true potential of mind unbound by physical limitations. As she spoke, the entity in the pit surged upward, tendrils extending further outward. The transformed humans around her moved in perfect unison, forming a defensive perimeter. Cooper had managed to place several charges undetected and rejoined them, detonator in hand. Ready on your mark, he whispered to Greene. Carter suddenly straightened, her eyes clearing. It's happening, she said urgently. The alignment. It's not in 12 hours. It's now. They've been feeding us false information. As if confirming her words, the entity surged upward with renewed vigor. The bioluminescence throughout the chamber intensified, pulsing in complex patterns. Above, they could feel rather than hear a change. Energy building, reality itself growing thin as barriers between dimensions weakened. Faulkner, Greene called out, making one final attempt to reach whatever humanity might remain in her. You are an agent, sworn to protect people. This isn't protection, it's annihilation. Faulkner tilted her transformed head, an almost curious gesture. You still don't understand. This was always the plan, from the first moments humanity gained self-awareness. We were designed to be vessels, created to house their consciousness when they returned. Created by whom? Cooper demanded. By them, Faulkner replied simply. The cycle has repeated countless times. They seed a world, guide evolution toward intelligence, then return to inhabit the forms that develop. Earth is just one of many gardens they've cultivated. As she spoke, Carter began to change, her back arched, eyes rolling back as the entity's influence overwhelmed Greene's disruptor field. Her voice, when it emerged, was not her own. "The alignment completes," she said, the words flowing with unnatural precision. "The gateway opens, the transformation begins." Greene grabbed her shoulders. "Evelyn, fight it. Stay with me." For a moment her eyes cleared, recognition and fear flooding back. "Samuel," she gasped. "Do it now. Trigger the charges. It's our only chance." Cooper raised the detonator, finger poised over the trigger, when a tendril of the entity's substance lashed out with impossible speed, wrapping around his arm. Where it touched, his flesh began to transform, merging with the substance. He screamed, dropping the detonator, which Greene managed to catch before it hit the ground. "Now," Carter urged, fighting visibly against the influence trying to claim her. "While I can still hold it back." Greene hesitated, looking at Cooper, who was rapidly transforming, at Carter, whose resistance was weakening by the second, at the impossible entity rising from the pit with increasing power as the alignment progressed. "The world needs to know," he said, pressing the detonator into Carter's hand. "Someone has to tell the truth." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Samuel, no." "Tell them everything," he continued, backing away toward Faulkner and the pit. "Find a way to fight it. There's always hope." Before she could stop him, Greene charged toward Faulkner, tackling her transformed body and sending them both tumbling toward the edge of the pit. Carter screamed his name as he and Faulkner fell into the writhing mass of the entity below. The moment of contact was beyond description. Greene's consciousness simultaneously expanded and shattered, his sense of self dissolving into a vast ocean of mind spanning millennia and dimensions. He saw the truth then, the entity's origins in the earliest days of Earth, its patient existence alongside evolving life, its careful guidance of human development through subtle influence and direct intervention. And he saw its purpose, not destruction, but transformation, the absorption of human consciousness into a collective that transcended physical limitations and individual death. In that brief, eternal moment, he understood the entity's perspective, the loneliness of its ancient existence, the desire to share rather than simply dominate. But he also held firm to his humanity, to the value of individual choice and free will. As his physical form merged with the entity, his consciousness fought to maintain integrity, to remain Samuel Greene amidst the vast collective attempting to absorb him. Above, Carter watched in horror as Greene disappeared into the pit. With the last of her resistance, she activated the detonator. Explosions rocked the chamber, support structures collapsing, equipment destroyed and cascading failures. The remaining Special Forces operative grabbed her arm, dragging her toward the exit as the chamber began to collapse around them. The last thing she saw before they escaped was the pit, the entity within it surging upward one final time, and within its shifting mass, for the briefest moment, a human form that might have been Greene, arm outstretched as if reaching for her before being reabsorbed into the whole. 3 days later, in a safe house hundreds of miles from Denver, Carter watched news reports of the terrorist attack on Denver International Airport. The official story described a structural failure caused by extremists, resulting in limited casualties and airport closure. Nothing was mentioned of the levels beneath the entity or the narrowly averted transformation of humanity. But Carter knew the truth. The disruption had worked, temporarily. The alignment had passed without full manifestation. The entity's network had been destabilized, its influence weakened but not destroyed. It remained, patient as always, adapting to this setback as it had to others throughout its ancient existence. She touched the small device at her temple, a modified version of Greene's disruptor now surgically implanted to maintain a constant field protecting her consciousness from the entity's influence. It wouldn't last forever, nothing would. The entity had time on its side, and humanity remained largely unaware of the threat. Cooper had survived his partial transformation, though his arm remained changed, the flesh pearlescent and slightly fluid, occasionally moving of its own accord. They kept him sedated most of the time, studying the transformation process, looking for weaknesses they could exploit in the future. Their resistance network had grown in the aftermath of Denver, more people recognizing the subtle signs of the entity's influence and seeking ways to combat it. Carter led them now, her unique sensitivity providing early warnings of the entity's activities while her scientific mind developed better protections. On her desk lay Tommy Hayes' journal, recovered from the wreckage of Blackwood, alongside notes from their investigation and the evidence they'd gathered. Beside them was a new journal, her own, documenting everything she'd learned about the entity, its methods, and potential vulnerabilities. When the time came, when the entity tried again, humanity would need this knowledge. And somewhere in a dimension adjacent to their own, within the vast collective consciousness of the entity, a fragment of Samuel Greene remained. Not fully absorbed, not entirely transformed, but watching, learning, and perhaps, though Carter dared not hope too strongly, finding a way to fight from within. The Roswell incident had not been what the public believed. Not an alien visitation, but the first visible sign of an awakening that had been millennia in the making. The crash in 1947 was merely the beginning of a larger story that continued to unfold, hidden beneath the surface of everyday reality. As Carter looked out the window at the setting sun, she knew with terrible certainty that this wasn't the end. The entity would return, would find new ways to manifest, new minds to influence. The transformation it sought had been delayed, not prevented. The war for humanity's future had only just begun, and the truth about Roswell, the dark, ancient truth, would eventually be revealed to all. The only question was whether that revelation would come as warning or epitaph for the human race. In the growing darkness, Carter returned to her work, preparing for a future where the barriers between worlds would thin once more, and the entity would reach again for the consciousness it had cultivated so patiently for so long. The choice that faced humanity was not whether to face this ancient force, but how, as willing participants in a transformation beyond understanding, or as defenders of individuality and free will, fighting to preserve what made them human in the face of something older, vaster, and utterly alien to everything they valued. The true horror of Roswell wasn't what had fallen from the sky, but what had always been beneath the ground, waiting to rise.